The first time Greg showed up in uniform, nobody questioned it. He walked into that barbecue fundraiser like he owned the place, pressed camouflage fatigues, shiny boots, a name tag that read Anderson, not even close to his real last name, and a chest full of fake medals he bought from an army surplus store on eBay. He even brought a duffel bag slung over his shoulder and kept a toothpick tucked in the corner of his mouth, chewing like he'd seen in movies. And the worst part, it worked. "Oh my God, thank you for your service." A woman near the grill gasped, clasping her hands to her heart. Greg gave a tight, solemn nod. "Just doing my duty, ma'am." "What duty?" He sold insurance. Badly. But ever since he'd watched a viral video of a man in uniform getting free ribs at a Texas steakhouse, Greg had an idea. A dumb one, sure, but the kind that seemed just clever enough to try once, or twice. Okay, maybe as many times as he could get away with. And that day at the fundraiser, he walked out with a free plate of food, a $200 gift card someone handed him for gas money, and 3 job leads from men who said they always hire vets. From that moment on, Greg was hooked. He didn't see it as lying. He saw it as improvising, enhancing the version of himself that never got around to enlisting. He hadn't exactly planned to fake being a soldier for money, but when life kept throwing unpaid bills and empty gas tanks at him, the uniform started to look like a shortcut to respect, to admiration, and most importantly, free stuff. But here's the thing about shortcuts. Eventually they lead you straight into a wall. Let's back up a little. Greg was 34 years old, living in Bakersfield, California, with a roommate named Derek, who hadn't paid rent in 4 months and played Fortnite professionally, or so he claimed. Greg himself had dreams once. He wanted to be a writer, even took some community college classes. But then life got in the way. A breakup, a layoff, a car that kept overheating every time he hit the highway. His self-esteem was buried somewhere between overdue credit card statements and rejection emails from jobs he didn't really want. And one night after scrolling Instagram and seeing yet another guy from high school post selfies in military gear, flanked by friends and patriotic hashtags, Greg felt something sour bubble up inside him. Not jealousy, exactly, more like resentment. "People only respect you if you've been to war," he muttered aloud, tossing his phone on the couch. Derek didn't look up from his game. "Then go to war, bro." Greg rolled his eyes. "Not that simple." "Could fake it," Derek mumbled, distracted. Greg blinked. "What? You heard me. Get the outfit. Make up a story. People eat that stuff up. Any reasonable person would have laughed it off, called it ridiculous. But Greg got in his car the next day and drove straight to the nearest military surplus store. His first fake appearance was at a gas station. He pulled in wearing his newly assembled uniform, not quite right but believable enough if you didn't know what you were looking for. An older man in a truck next to him nodded in respect. "You just get back?" Greg paused, caught off guard. Yeah, 2 weeks ago." The man saluted him. Greg returned it, awkwardly. The guy insisted on paying for his gas. "Yes, Greg didn't argue. He filled up, drove away, and laughed to himself the whole ride home. It had worked. Over the next month, Greg refined the lie. He created a backstory. Afghanistan, 2 tours. He picked a fake rank, staff sergeant, claimed he had a knee injury that kept him from re-enlisting. He printed a fake VA card and started showing up to diners, stores, and weekend festivals. Anywhere with a veteran discount sign became his new hangout. And people bought it. He got a free haircut, a free breakfast, even a date with a woman named Tammy who said she always had a thing for uniforms. Things were looking up until he met Carl. Carl was the real deal. An actual veteran. Retired, big guy, quiet, wore a Navy cap everywhere. Greg met him at a 4th of July street fair where he was pretending to raise money for a wounded warrior benefit. He'd printed a poster borrowed a table, and was collecting cash donations in a plastic jug. Carl walked up, arms crossed, and stared at him for a long minute. Greg did his usual routine. Afghanistan, 2 tours. 101st Airborne. Carl nodded slowly. What company? Greg blinked. Bravo. Carl raised an eyebrow. Who was your CO? Greg hesitated. Carl's eyes narrowed. What base were you out of? Greg's mouth went dry. Carl didn't blink. Say one more lie, and I'm calling the cops. Greg froze. People were starting to look. Carl stepped closer. You think it's funny wearing that? Think it's cute to fake trauma for money? Greg stammered. I was just... Carl snatched the fake donation jug, ripped the patch off Greg's jacket, and pointed to the crowd. This man is not a veteran. He's a liar, and he's stealing from people who gave everything. The silence was deafening. Someone gasped. Someone else started filming. Greg turned and bolted. He ran all the way to his car, heart pounding, jacket half ripped, adrenaline crashing through him like a freight train. It was over. Or so he thought. But karma wasn't done with Greg yet. The video went viral. Fake soldier exposed at charity event. It got picked up by a local news outlet, then national. He lost his job. What little of it there was, he couldn't show his face at any store or diner without people whispering, pointing, or worse. His own mom called him and cried. Greg, how could you? He tried to deny it, tried to spin it, said it was a prank, said he was making a statement. No one bought it, and just when it seemed like it couldn't get worse, he got summoned to court. Stolen valor, fraud, public deception. He was fined, put on probation, and ordered to do 500 hours of community service, most of which took place at an actual veterans center. The irony, the people he once pretended to be were now the ones supervising his sentence. And at first, they wanted nothing to do with him. They kept their distance, rolled their eyes, made it clear he didn't belong. But over time, something strange happened. Greg started listening, really listening. He heard stories, real ones, about bravery, loss, friendship, and pain. He met men and women who had seen things he couldn't imagine and still found a way to smile. And slowly, painfully, something in him cracked open. He stopped pretending, stopped lying, and started showing up. Not in uniform, but in truth. One day Carl walked past him during cleanup duty and said, without looking, "You've got a lot of nerve." Greg nodded. "I know." Carl paused. "But you're not wasting it anymore." It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a start. Greg never imagined that pushing a broom in a veterans center could be the most humbling experience of his life. At first it was just a sentence, a humiliating punishment for pretending to be someone he wasn't. He'd show up at 7:00 a.m., mop floors, wipe down tables, refill coffee pots, and empty trash bags in silence while the veterans played dominoes, watched TV, or simply sat and stared out the window. No one talked to him. A few nodded in passing, but most gave him that look, the kind that burned right through you. He had earned it. And in a strange, painful way, he didn't resent them for it. They had the right. Every step he took with a mop in hand felt like penance. Every grunt of indifference felt like a reminder. You lied about surviving something these people actually lived through. And yet he didn't quit. He showed up every day on time, did the work, and never once complained. For a guy who used to fake entire backstories to get free pancakes, that was growth. After a few weeks, the silence began to crack. One afternoon, an older veteran named Bill, wheelchair-bound and fond of talking to the vending machine, looked up as Greg passed with a dustpan and muttered, "You missed a spot." It was said with the faintest smirk. Greg froze, glanced at the small patch of floor Bill was pointing to, and chuckled. "Thanks, Sergeant." Bill raised an eyebrow. "I was Navy." Greg nodded. "Then thanks, Petty Officer." That was the first conversation. Small, harmless. But it was something a week later. Another vet tossed Greg a pack of gum and said, "You look like you need to fix your breath before talking to people." More chuckles. Eventually someone invited him to join a card game, only once and only as a substitute. But still the wall was starting to crack. Greg began listening more closely to the conversations around him. He heard about lost friends, missed birthdays, and nights where the silence was louder than any explosion. He heard about marriages that didn't survive deployments, kids they barely knew, and moments that haunted them decades later. These weren't stories from movies. They were real, raw, and they came without exaggeration. No one in that room had anything left to prove. They'd already done the hardest parts. And Greg, for the first time, understood just how insulting it had been to wear a story that wasn't his. The guilt settled in his chest like an anchor. But the work became more than just service hours. It became routine. It became a strange form of therapy. Outside the center, Greg kept a low profile. He deactivated his social media, switched phone numbers, started driving to a grocery store 2 neighborhoods away, just to avoid side eyes from people who still recognized him. Derek, his old roommate, had finally moved out after getting a gig streaming games full-time. Greg didn't miss him. He liked the quiet. It gave him space to think, to reflect, and to figure out what kind of person he actually wanted to become. One afternoon after work, he stood in front of his bathroom mirror and whispered, "You don't have to keep pretending." He wasn't sure who he was talking to. Maybe the old version of himself, the one who needed a fake identity to feel worth something. Maybe the ghost of the lie he'd built and burned. Either way, it felt like a beginning. 3 months into his sentence, he received a letter in the mail. Handwritten, no return address. He opened it slowly, heart thudding with suspicion. Inside, in simple cursive script, was a single sentence: "Everyone gets one mistake. It's what you do after that counts." Greg didn't know who sent it. He assumed Carl, or maybe Bill. He taped it to his refrigerator and stared at it every morning while waiting for his coffee to brew. And little by little that line began shaping his days. The Veterans Center eventually offered him a small stipend to stay on part-time after his sentence ended. Just maintenance and cleanup. Nothing glamorous. He accepted without hesitation, not because of the money, but because it gave him a sense of place, a sense of usefulness. And on days when it got quiet, he found himself reading first military memoirs, then novels, then nonfiction about identity, service, and psychology. He even started writing again, little essays, nothing serious. But it felt good to put words down for the sake of expression rather than manipulation. One Thursday morning, he walked in to find Carl sitting alone in the common room with a crossword puzzle. Greg nodded respectfully and started sweeping. Without looking up, Carl asked, "You ever figure out what unit you lied about being in?" Greg blinked. "Yeah. Continue first, Airborne. Bravo Company. I made it up because it sounded tough." Carl finally looked at him. "That's my unit." Greg froze. "What?" Carl folded his paper. "I was in Bravo, Kandahar. 2 tours." Greg swallowed hard. "I swear, I didn't know." Carl studied him. "I know." The silence that followed wasn't angry. It was heavy, but not cold. "You're still here," Carl added. "That means something." Greg nodded. "It means everything." That day marked a shift. Carl didn't offer friendship, exactly, but he stopped avoiding him. Occasionally asked him to help fix a chair leg or reach something off a high shelf. Small gestures, but enough to show that whatever hatred Carl might have once carried for Greg had been filed under not worth the energy anymore. Greg didn't need praise, just peace. Later that month, the local high school asked for a volunteer to speak on Veterans Appreciation Day. The center's usual rep had a scheduling conflict. Carl, of all people, suggested Greg. "You want redemption," he said. "You tell the truth. All of it." Greg hesitated. He wasn't sure the world was ready to hear from a man who faked a uniform. But then again, maybe they needed to. Maybe the message wasn't about the lie. Maybe it was about the transformation. So he said yes. And when the day came, he stood in front of a gym full of teenagers, hands slightly trembling, voice low but steady. "My name is Greg," he began. "And I used to lie about being a soldier. You could hear a pin drop. I did it for attention, for free stuff, for things I thought I deserved. But I hadn't earned any of it. And I paid the price. I lost jobs, friends, and my dignity. But I also gained something, perspective. The chance to become honest, to actually serve, even in the smallest ways. And I learned that bravery isn't just about the battlefield. Sometimes it's about owning your failure and doing better." When he finished, the room remained quiet for a beat. Then came a few claps. Then more, until the entire gym was applauding. Not because he was a hero, but because he was human. Afterward, a teacher approached him. That took guts. Greg nodded, took shame first. She smiled. That's usually how it starts. Greg didn't expect the school speech to change much. He assumed he'd go home, heat up some leftover pasta, maybe get a nod from Carl the next day and then move on. But something was different when he walked into the Veterans Center that week. People looked at him a little longer. Not suspiciously, more like they were reevaluating him. The woman who managed the front desk, Rita, who barely acknowledged his presence before, offered him a slice of banana bread. "Saw the video online," she said. "You did good." Greg blinked. "Video." Rita nodded. "Someone recorded your speech, posted it on the school's page. It's got a couple thousand views." His stomach dropped. That familiar dread crept in. The fear of going viral, again for all the wrong reasons. But this time it was different. The comments weren't full of hate. They were respectful, curious. This guy owned up to it, took the hit, did the work, redemption arc in real life, more honest than half the people in Congress. And Greg felt something he hadn't in a long time, relief, not because everyone forgave him, but because he didn't have to keep hiding anymore. The next few weeks brought quiet but meaningful changes. A local community podcast asked to interview him. A youth group invited him to talk about integrity and personal growth. He kept saying yes, not out of ego, but because it gave him a sense of purpose. He was no longer a guy pretending to serve. He was actually showing up. And in his own awkward, piecemeal way, he was helping. One night, after a long shift at the center, Greg sat in his tiny apartment with a notebook open on the kitchen table. Max, the neighbor's dog he'd unofficially adopted, was snoring under his chair. Greg scribbled down notes for a short essay he wanted to publish, not about war, not about heroism, but about mistakes, about being a liar, about becoming something better without pretending to be something perfect. He titled it, "The Uniform I Didn't Earn." And even before it was done, he knew it was the most honest thing he'd ever written. Around that time, something else happened that Greg hadn't seen coming. He reconnected with his father. They hadn't spoken in almost 5 years, not since Greg skipped Thanksgiving, lied about a job interview, and disappeared into a cloud of excuses. But now, after everything, he felt like reaching out. He didn't know what to say. So he sent a text, "Hi, Dad. I messed up a lot, but I'm working on it. I'd like to see you sometime." His dad replied a day later, "Dinner Thursday? Same diner?" They met at a small 24-hour joint on the edge of town. His dad was older, grayer, quieter. He didn't mention the news stories or the video, just sat across from Greg sipping black coffee and said, "How's life treating you?" And Greg, without spinning, exaggerating, or dodging, told him the truth about the lie, the fallout, the service work, the school speech. His dad didn't interrupt, just listened, really listened, like he was trying to understand the man across from him for the first time in years. When Greg finished, he waited for a reaction, judgment, disappointment. But his dad just nodded. "I raised you better," he said. Then after a pause, "But I'm proud you got yourself back." Greg didn't cry in the diner, but he did excuse himself to the bathroom for a minute. Meanwhile, life at the Veterans Center continued, and with it came one more unexpected turn. Bill, the Navy vet in the wheelchair, approached Greg one afternoon with a request. "You write," Greg raised an eyebrow. "Trying to." Bill wheeled closer, holding out a thick notebook. "These are my journals. From back then. Stuff I've never told my kids. I think someone should make sense." Greg took the notebook carefully. "You want me to write your story?" Bill shrugged. "Not write it. Just shape it. So it's not lost." Greg opened to the first page. The handwriting was rough. The ink faded in places, but the weight of it hit him instantly. This wasn't just paper. This was a life. He nodded. "I'll do it." They worked on it for weeks. Bill dictated. Greg typed, edited, clarified. What started as a favor turned into a collaboration, into trust. Greg was no longer the outsider. He was the guy they called when the printer jammed, when someone needed help logging into email, when a story needed to be told. He was part of something. But just as things began to settle, a curveball landed. A reporter from a major news outlet reached out. She wanted to do a piece on stolen valor, and Greg's story had come across her radar. "We're not here to roast you," she said. "We want to talk about the full arc, where you started, where you are." Greg hesitated. The old fear stirred again. Was he ready to reopen that door to a national audience? Was he strong enough to be a cautionary tale without becoming a punchline again? He called Carl, asked for advice. Carl Everblunt said, "You want the lie to die? Tell the truth louder than you ever told the lie." So Greg agreed. The interview was raw, honest, sometimes painful. He spoke about shame, about hiding, about the weight of pretending and the relief of finally being known. When the article dropped, the title read, "The Man Who Faked a War, and Then Found a Different Kind of Fight." The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in, from people who'd lied about things they were ashamed of, from veterans who appreciated his accountability, from teachers asking to share the article with their students. Greg didn't let it go to his head. He let it sink into his bones. Then came the biggest moment yet. The Veterans Center director, Rita, pulled him aside with a folder in hand. "There's a grant," she said, "for outreach writing programs led by veterans or civilians working with veteran communities. I think you should apply." Greg stared at her. "Me?" Rita nodded. "You're already doing it. Might as well get paid." Greg applied, wrote an essay, attached Bill's project as a sample. He didn't expect anything, but 2 months later he received the letter, accepted, funding approved. He was officially going to launch a weekly writing workshop at the center, helping vets tell their stories, put their memories into words, even if just for themselves. And in that moment, as he stood in his apartment holding the approval letter, Greg felt the full circle click into place. He had once put on a fake uniform for respect. Now he wore no uniform. And yet the respect came anyway, not because he pretended to be brave, but because he finally had the courage to stop pretending at all. The first day of the writing workshop didn't go exactly how Greg imagined. He'd spent the entire weekend planning index cards, sample prompts, even a slide deck he didn't end up using because the projector wouldn't turn on. He stood at the front of the multi-purpose room with a dry erase marker in one hand and a knot in his stomach. 5 chairs were filled. 3 of the men were regulars at the center, including Bill, who gave Greg a subtle thumbs up as he rolled in. One woman sat near the door, arms crossed, eyes wary, and then there was a man in the back, older stiff posture, arms tattooed with unit markings that told a story before he said a word. His name was Leon. Greg introduced himself carefully, still feeling out the atmosphere. "I'm not here to teach you how to be writers," he said. "I'm here to help you say something that matters to you. Doesn't have to be pretty, doesn't have to be long, just has to be yours." The room stayed quiet. Greg could feel their skepticism. Some of these people had been through fire, actual fire, and now they were being asked to trust a guy who once faked a service patch for a free breakfast. He took a breath and grabbed a marker. "Let's start simple," he said, writing the word firsts on the board. "Your first base, your first patrol, your first letter home, your first time being scared. You pick." No one moved. Then Bill cleared his throat. "My first barracks had rats bigger than my boot," he said. Laughter broke the silence. The woman by the door smirked. Leon grunted. Greg nodded. "That's a start. Keep going." And just like that, the wall cracked again. Over the next hour, words filled the page. Not full essays, just fragments, images, memories, but real, honest. And when they left that day, Greg felt something new. Not just relief, but alignment. Like this, helping others find their voice was what he was always supposed to do. Not by faking strength, but by holding space for truth. The workshop became a weekly ritual. More people showed up. Rita brought cookies. Someone donated notebooks. Greg noticed how the room changed week by week, not just in tone but in posture. Shoulders loosened, eyes lifted, jokes returned, stories got longer. One guy who hadn't spoken a full sentence in a month wrote a poem about sleeping in a tent during a sandstorm. Another shared a letter he'd never sent to a fallen friend. Greg never judged the content, never corrected grammar, just asked, "Is that how it really felt?" And the answers came like slow rivers, steady, winding, and deep. Outside of the center, Greg's life continued to shift in unexpected ways. He got a part-time job at the local library, shelving books and helping with tech support. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid rent and came with quiet mornings surrounded by stories, something that after years of noise felt like medicine. On weekends, he visited his dad. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they just watched sports. And for once, silence between them didn't feel like failure. It felt like understanding. Greg even reconnected with Tammy, the woman he once dated while pretending to be a soldier. She'd reached out after reading the article. Curious, but cautious. They met for coffee. She brought a list of questions. "Why'd you lie?" was the first. "Because I didn't think anyone would respect the real me," he said. "Do you now?" she asked. Greg had paused, then answered honestly. "I'm learning to." She didn't promise a second date, but she said she admired the effort. That was enough. One day, after a particularly emotional writing session, Greg stayed behind to help clean up. Leon lingered too, his thick hands thumbing the edge of his notebook. "Didn't think I'd like this," he said gruffly. "Didn't think I'd show up more than once." Greg nodded, wiping down a table. "Why'd you keep coming?" Leon shrugged. "Same reason I kept re-upping. You find a team that gets it, you stay close." Greg smiled. "This place is different from the field." Leon looked at him. "Not that different. Still got people carrying weight they can't name. Still got silence that says more than words. You just listen better now." Greg let that settle in. Leon wasn't the compliment type. That last sentence was the equivalent of a standing ovation. "Thanks for saying that," Greg replied quietly. "Means more than you know." The weeks turned into months. The workshop was extended through spring. Greg started offering one-on-one sessions for those who wanted to go deeper. Bill's memoir draft reached 50 pages. Rita talked about publishing a zine with selected pieces from the group. Local businesses offered to sponsor print copies. And for the first time in a long time, Greg had more to do than time to do it in. He didn't mind, he liked the busy, he liked the purpose, and every now and then he caught his own reflection in a window or a bathroom mirror and thought, that guy looks like someone I'd trust. But redemption, Greg was learning, isn't a straight line. It's a winding path, with setbacks. One afternoon while grocery shopping, a man recognized him, someone who'd seen the original viral video, not the follow-ups. "You're that fake soldier, right?" the man spat. "Still scamming people?" Greg froze, holding a box of cereal. "I made a mistake," he said, "and I'm working to make it right." The man scoffed. People like you don't change." Greg didn't argue, just paid for his groceries and walked out slowly, heart pounding. It stuck with him for days. Not because he believed the man, but because part of him feared the world never would stop seeing him that way. That maybe no amount of truth could fully bury the lie. He brought it up in the next writing session, raw and unfiltered. "What do you do when people only see the worst version of you?" he asked. The room fell quiet. Then Leon said, "You keep showing up, even if they never change their mind." "Because you did," Bill added. "You don't do the work so they'll forget. You do it so you remember who you are now." Greg swallowed hard. I needed to hear that. The woman who once sat with her arms crossed leaned in. "Redemption isn't about the past. It's about what you choose today, and tomorrow, and the next." And Greg realized they weren't just healing, they were teaching each other how to carry the weight without letting it crush them. At the end of that session, Rita pulled Greg aside. "We got invited to speak at the state conference on veteran programs. I want you to represent us." Greg blinked. "Me?" Rita smiled. "You've earned it." He didn't know what he'd say. He didn't know if he was ready, but he said yes, anyway. Because the old Greg would have lied his way onto that stage. The new one knew how to stand there with nothing but the truth. Greg had never spoken at a conference before, let alone one focused on veteran services and programs. The invitation both thrilled and terrified him. He kept picturing himself up there, spotlight hot on his forehead, microphone squealing with feedback, audience arms folded in silent judgment, all waiting for the man who once wore a fake uniform to redeem himself in real time. For days, he couldn't sleep. He rewrote his speech 5 times, pacing his apartment, scribbling and crossing out paragraphs, reading lines out loud only to discard them because they sounded either too rehearsed or too ashamed. He didn't want to sound like a motivational poster. He didn't want to sell redemption like a product. He wanted to sound real, human, messy, even. Because that's what the truth had been for him, not a clean narrative arc, but a jagged path of mistakes, consequences, and slow, painful rebuilding. In the end, he didn't bring a script, just a few bullet points, just his voice. The conference hall was bigger than he imagined. Rows of chairs stretched farther than his eyes could count, most already filled with people who had lived more, lost more, and endured more than he probably ever would. Veterans, counselors, directors, family members, and somewhere in the back corner, he spotted Rita, Leon, Bill, and a few others from the writing group. They were there for him. That thought anchored him. When his name was announced, there was a pause. A shifting of weight in chairs, a collective sense of, isn't he that guy? But Greg walked to the stage anyway, steady but not stiff, and stood at the microphone, heart pounding like a drum line in his chest. "My name's Greg Whitman," he began, "and I'm not a veteran." Silence. "But 3 years ago I pretended to be. I wore a uniform I didn't earn. I lied to strangers. I took things I didn't deserve, and eventually I got caught. The air was still, no gasps, no heckling, just a dense, quiet focus. This is not the part where I say I'm sorry and ask for applause," he continued. "This is the part where I tell you what came after. I was sentenced to community service at a veterans center. I expected cold shoulders, and I got them. I expected anger, and I got that too. But I also got something I didn't expect. I got education, I got perspective, and eventually I got a second chance, not just to do better, but to be better. He told them about the writing workshop, about Bill's memoir, about helping people tell their truths, while finally learning how to own his own. He told them about walking into the grocery store and being reminded of who he used to be and choosing not to run from it. I used to think the worst thing that could happen was being exposed, he said. Turns out the worst thing is never being known at all. I spent years pretending because I didn't think the real me was enough. But now I know I don't need a uniform to matter. I just need to keep showing up. When he finished, there was a moment of stillness, then applause, polite at first, then stronger. A few people even stood. Greg stepped away from the microphone and exhaled deeply, not out of pride, but out of profound relief. He didn't bomb, he didn't crumble, he told the truth, and he was still standing. Afterward, as people mingled, several approached him. Some wanted to shake his hand. A few had tears in their eyes. One woman, maybe in her 60s, grabbed his shoulder and said, "My brother took his life after leaving the army. He didn't think anyone would ever understand what he carried. Thank you for creating space for people like him." Greg nearly lost it right there. Not because he felt like a hero, but because he realized the ripple effect of his actions. Both the lies and the truth had reached farther than he ever imagined. In the weeks that followed, the workshop at the center tripled in size. Word spread, not just about Greg's story, but about what the group had become. A place not of pity, but of power. Vets who had stayed silent for decades were writing again. Some were laughing, some were crying, all were healing. And Greg kept facilitating, not as a leader, but as a witness. He never claimed to have the answers. He just asked better questions. Where does your pain live? What truth are you afraid to write down? What would happen if you did? And every time someone answered, the room shifted. Another wall came down. Another silence got filled. One afternoon, Leon brought in a photograph. It was faded, creased, but powerful. 3 soldiers standing in front of a Humvee, dust in the air, all grinning like they'd just won the lottery. Leon pointed to the middle one. That was me, 2 weeks before the blast. Greg didn't ask questions, just listened. He didn't make it, Leon added, tapping the soldier on the left, and I haven't said his name out loud in 15 years, until last week. In your session, Greg nodded slowly. He deserves to be remembered. Leon folded the photo back into his pocket. He does, and I think I do too. It wasn't all smooth sailing. Greg still had days where doubt crept in, nights where he wondered if he deserved all this grace, all this forward momentum. But then he'd read a new poem from one of the group members, or receive an email from a student who saw his talk online, or just sit with Max the dog in quiet gratitude. And he'd remember something Carl once said, "You don't do this to erase the past, you do it to honor the fact that you survived it." One day, Rita handed him a manila envelope. "You've got an invitation," she said with a smirk. Greg opened it and nearly dropped the contents. It was a formal request from the State Veterans Commission to join an advisory board on civilian-military partnerships in community programs. "They want your input," Rita said. "Not as a token, as a builder." Greg didn't know what to say. He laughed. Then he cried. Then he signed the form. That evening, he walked home as the sun dipped behind the buildings, casting long shadows and golden light on the pavement. He thought about where he started, standing in front of a grill with fake medals and a borrowed name tag lying through his teeth for a free lunch. And he thought about now, paperwork in his hand, real opportunities unfolding, real people trusting him, not because he faked courage, but because he finally learned what it meant. When he got home, he sat at his desk, opened his journal, and wrote, "Karma didn't just hit me, it cracked me open. And inside, I found something worth keeping." Greg used to believe that you had to hit rock bottom to change. that people only really transformed after some kind of catastrophic failure or dramatic wake-up call. And in some ways, his own crash, being publicly exposed, humiliated, and sentenced to clean floors for people he had disrespected, fit that mold. But now, with over a year of rebuilding behind him, he understood something more nuanced. Change didn't just come from the crash, it came from the quiet, repetitive work that followed. The mornings when no one applauded, the moments when you told the truth, even though no one asked, the choice to keep showing up when shame whispered that you shouldn't. That's where the real shift happened. And Greg was knee-deep in that shift, building something meaningful one honest hour at a time. The advisory board meetings started small, mostly introductions and logistical chatter about budgets, outreach, and retention. Greg was quiet at first, listening, learning the language of institutional programs. These weren't people with checkered pasts or viral scandals. They were polished, composed, often career professionals with degrees and decades of experience. But after a few sessions, Greg began to notice something interesting. They all spoke about veterans the way politicians speak about the people, well-meaning but distant, like they were protecting an idea rather than serving real individuals. One afternoon, during a discussion about marketing strategies for a new PTSD awareness campaign, Greg finally raised his hand. "Have you asked any of the veterans what they think about this design?" The room went silent. A woman in a tailored blazer blinked. "We've reviewed it internally." Greg nodded. "Right. But has anyone asked a vet who's actually dealing with PTSD if this speaks to them? Because I can already tell you some of the guys I work with would see this and laugh. Or get pissed." The silence held for a second longer, then someone cleared their throat and said, "Noted." Greg didn't push harder. He didn't need to. His job, he realized, was not to shout from the rooftops. It was to plant seeds, truthful and comfortable ones, and let them grow where they needed to. Back at the center, the workshop evolved into something more than a writing group. It became a kind of sanctuary, not always quiet, not always peaceful, but always real. Veterans came in with scars, stories, and silences. Some wrote every week, others just sat and listened. Greg began inviting guest speakers, local authors, trauma therapists, even a stand-up comic who used to do USO tours. The variety sparked new energy. One day someone brought in a guitar. Another day someone brought cookies shaped like dog tags. The line between therapy and community blurred in the best way, and Greg, once an outsider, was now woven into the fabric of it. But growth often invites the past back in. It was a Wednesday afternoon when Greg received an email that made his hands tremble. The subject line read, "Subject Podcast Inquiry. Stolen Valor Redemption Story." The message was from the producer of one of the biggest interview podcasts in the country, a show that featured viral stories of scandal, comeback, and transformation. They wanted him on. "Well, we followed your journey from the original video to the Veterans Center to the conference." The email read. "They think your voice matters." Greg stared at the screen for a long time. Part of him was excited. The platform could amplify the message. More awareness, more funding, more good. But another part of him felt naked, vulnerable. What if the audience didn't see the transformation? What if they only saw the lie? What if someone from his past showed up in the comments to remind the world who he used to be? He brought the idea to the group. "What do you think?" he asked, after explaining the invitation. Bill leaned back in his chair and said, "Do it, but don't perform. Just tell the truth." Leon added, "Don't do it for us. Do it if you can handle being hated again." The woman by the door, now a weekly regular, simply said, "You're not that guy anymore. But he's part of your story. Bring him with you." And that sealed it. The podcast recording was scheduled for a Friday morning. Greg showed up early, sat in the soundproof booth, and took a deep breath as the host smiled from across the table. "You ready?" she asked. Greg nodded. "As I'll ever be." They talked for over an hour, about his lie, about the moment he got caught, about the public humiliation, but also about the community service, the writing, the people he met, the way telling the truth started to feel better than being praised. "Do you still think about the uniform?" the host asked toward the end. Greg paused. "Every day," he admitted, but not with pride or shame. More like gratitude. It showed me what I was missing, and what I had to earn. When the episode aired, Greg braced himself for the backlash. He didn't check comments, didn't open Twitter, just went about his routine, feeding Max, sweeping the center's hallways, helping Bill trim his pages down to something publishable. But something funny happened. The hate didn't come. Instead, messages trickled in, private ones. A firefighter who once lied about his age to get into the academy. A single mom who forged a degree to land a job she eventually earned the right way. A teacher who plagiarized an essay in college and had never forgiven herself. The stories were endless, and every one of them ended the same way. "Thank you for showing that people like us can still change." That weekend, Greg was invited to a fundraiser gala hosted by a regional military nonprofit. He didn't want to go. "I don't own a tie," he muttered to Rita. "Then borrow one," she shot back. He went. The ballroom was filled with glittering dresses, crisp suits, and tall flags. It was the kind of place he would have lied to enter a year ago. Now he entered through the front door, name on the list, greeted with warm nods and firm handshakes. A few people recognized him from the podcast. One man clapped him on the shoulder and said, "You're the reason my son's writing again." Greg smiled. "I'm just the guy holding the pen sometimes." By the end of the night, a woman from a university approached him. "We're launching a Veterans Studies program," she said. "We'd love for you to teach a workshop, maybe even guest lecture." Greg blinked. "I'm not qualified." She tilted her head. "But you're experienced, and that matters more." He took her card. Didn't say yes, but didn't say no either. Later that night, Greg stood in his apartment looking out the window. The street was quiet, moonlight casting soft silver shadows across the sidewalk. He thought of the man he used to be, the faker, the liar, the desperate version of himself who tried to wear borrowed courage because he didn't believe his own would ever be enough. That man wasn't gone. He lived in Greg's memory like an old scar, but he wasn't steering the ship anymore. Greg whispered into the stillness, "You were wrong. We didn't need the uniform. We just needed the truth." And somewhere in the stillness it felt like that old self finally let go. Winter arrived quietly that year without the dramatic downpour or chaos of storms, just cold mornings, early sunsets, and a stillness that wrapped around the city like a blanket. For Greg it was the first holiday season in years that didn't feel performative. There was no pretending, no exhausting act of being someone he wasn't. Just slow mornings, warm cups of coffee, and meaningful hours spent at the center where the writing workshop had now expanded into 2 weekly sessions and an informal Thursday night round table where veterans came to talk even when they didn't feel like writing. Greg loved those nights most. Sometimes no one wrote a word. Sometimes they argued. Sometimes they just shared snacks and told stories, some true, some exaggerated, but all healing in their own way. That space had become something sacred, an honest room where no one had to prove anything, where medals didn't matter, and silence was respected as much as speech. One evening, Bill brought in a photo album and passed it around. Black and white snapshots of his grandfather's war days, mixed in with letters and odd scraps, a ration card, a pressed flower, a candy wrapper from the 1940s. He never talked about it, Bill said, flipping a page. But he kept every piece like it mattered. That line stuck with Greg. Kept every piece like it mattered. That's what they were doing now, gathering the pieces, the fragments, the memories that didn't make the history books but shaped them nonetheless. Greg had started a binder of group writings. With permission, he made copies of selected poems and stories and organized them by theme, loss, bravery, regret, humor. He called it Voices at Ease. And though it wasn't public yet, he printed a dozen copies and gave them to the group. At the year's end, they didn't say much when he handed them out, just nodded, flipped through the pages, some smiling quietly, some wiping their eyes. "This matters," Leon said finally, "more than any headline." Meanwhile, the invitation from the university had turned into a real opportunity. Greg had met with the program director, toured the campus, and sat in on a few classes. He still didn't feel qualified in the traditional sense, but that word had started to lose its grip on him. What qualified someone to guide others through their own truth? Not credentials, not GPA, presence, empathy, listening without flinching. By those standards, he was finally starting to believe maybe he was enough. They offered him a part-time teaching role for the spring semester, a workshop on memoir and lived experience in the context of veteran storytelling. It was niche, but it was real, and it was his. In the weeks leading up to the course, Greg spent hours planning. He reread the stories from the group, studied articles on trauma-informed writing, built lesson plans that included both technique and space for reflection. He even created a unit called Owning the Ugly, where students would explore moments they were ashamed of, not to confess, but to reclaim. As he typed out that phrase, "owning the ugly," he paused, hand hovering over the keyboard. It felt like the title of his own life's chapter. The part where the hero wasn't brave or noble, just honest. On the first day of class, he walked into the university building with a backpack slung over one shoulder, trying not to overthink it. The students were older than he expected, many of them veterans, some civilian adult learners, all carrying their own version of a story they hadn't figured out how to tell yet. Greg introduced himself plainly. No fancy bio, no overcompensating speech. Just, "I'm not a therapist. I'm not here to tell you what to write. I'm just someone who screwed up, learned from it, and figured out that telling the truth is more powerful than pretending to be strong." That semester changed everything. The classroom became a new kind of sanctuary. Every week, Greg watched his students grow bolder, digging into emotional terrain that had once been off-limits. One student, a Marine who had been medically discharged after an IED attack, wrote a chilling piece about waking up in the hospital and thinking he was in a dream. Another student, a military spouse, wrote a letter to the version of herself who waited through every deployment, holding her breath every time the phone rang. And one young man, soft-spoken, maybe 23, shared a piece titled, "I Was There Too," detailing how being a supply clerk didn't make him feel like a soldier, even though he wore the same uniform. After he read it aloud, the room was silent. Then someone said, "You were there, that's enough." Greg didn't have to lead that response. The class had become its own ecosystem of trust. Outside the classroom, the podcast episode continued to ripple. A local nonprofit reached out with a donation offer. "Whatever you need to keep that writing group going," they said. Greg used it to buy supplies. Better notebooks, new pens, even a set of folding chairs so they could accommodate more people. The group grew in size over the winter. Greg started keeping a log, not of attendance, but of insights, little things he overheard, phrases that lingered. He jotted down one in particular that stayed with him. "Sometimes the words don't come until you let go of who you thought you had to be." And yet, despite all this growth, Greg still had moments of doubt. One Saturday morning, while preparing for class, he received a message from an unfamiliar email. The subject line was stark: "Do you deserve this?" The message was brief, cruel. "You're still a fraud, just with better PR." He stared at it for a long time. Didn't reply, didn't delete it either. Just sat with the old pain it triggered, letting it wash over him without drowning in it. Because that voice, the one that said he'd never be enough, wasn't new. It had lived in his head long before he put on a fake uniform. But now he knew better than to believe it. He printed the message, folded it, and slipped it into the back of his binder, the one labeled Voices at Ease, not to memorialize the hate, but to remember what it felt like, and how far he'd come. Later that day in class, one student raised a hand and asked, "What do you do when someone throws your past back at you?" Greg paused, then answered, "You thank them for the reminder. Then you keep walking." That night as snow started to fall outside his apartment window, Greg sat down at his desk and wrote a new piece. Not for anyone else, just for himself. It started simply, "I faked the man I wanted to be. Now I'm becoming him without the lie." Spring arrived gently, as if the world itself was trying not to disturb the new rhythm Greg had created. The trees bloomed cautiously, the mornings carried a trace of warmth, and the days stretched just enough to remind everyone that winter was not forever. For Greg, the season brought a quiet clarity, a deep sense of alignment he hadn't known in years. It was the first spring in a long time that didn't feel like a reset forced upon him, but rather a continuation of something that had finally taken root. The writing workshops were thriving, both at the center and at the university. Students were sharing pieces in front of strangers with trembling hands and tear-streaked cheeks, and Greg watched them with pride, not as a teacher above them, but as someone walking the same path a few steps ahead. It amazed him, honestly, that a man who once lied about serving his country now helped others tell their truths, and that somehow that truth mattered more than the lie ever did. He'd learned to stop chasing perfect endings. What he craved now was progress. Moments of honesty, connection, depth. He didn't need applause or forgiveness from the entire world. Just a sense that he was moving in the right direction. That each day brought a little more light into the spaces that had long been dark. That's what made what happened next so difficult to process. One morning Greg arrived at the Veterans Center to find Rita pacing outside with a clipboard clutched tightly in her hands. Her expression was unreadable. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to suppress the wave of worry that rose in his chest. "Audit," she said flatly. "Someone reported us for misuse of funds. Anonymous tip. They're looking into all recent donations, including the grant for the writing program." Greg blinked. Misuse. "We've documented everything, I know," Rita said. "But that doesn't mean it'll be easy. Paperwork's one thing. Perception is another." Over the next few days, the center buzzed with tension. Inspectors came and went. Files were pulled. Emails printed. Greg sat through 2 interviews, answering questions about spending, receipts, attendance logs. It wasn't hostile, just exhausting. And somewhere deep in the unease, Greg feared the shadow of his past was reaching up again. Maybe someone had it out for him. Maybe the email that accused him of being a fraud wasn't the last. Maybe, despite everything he had done to make amends, someone still saw him as the man who put on a uniform for likes. But the audit came and went. A few procedural notes. Nothing major. No wrongdoing found. Still, the experience rattled Greg more than he expected. It reminded him how fragile trust could be, how easy it was for people to believe the worst, especially when the worst had once been true. After the final inspection, Greg sat alone in the empty common room, the silence pressing against his ribs like a weight. Bill found him there, sipping cold coffee and staring at a blank notebook. "You all right?" Bill asked, wheeling in beside him. Greg shrugged. "I'm fine, just tired of feeling like the past is a rope I can't shake off." Bill nodded. "You're not supposed to shake it off, you're supposed to carry it better." Greg looked at him. "Sometimes I wonder if I'll always be that guy to someone." Bill leaned back in his chair. "You probably will, but here's the thing. If you keep living like you're still trying to prove something, they win. But if you live like the truth is already enough, they fade." Greg didn't say anything, just nodded slowly. Let the words settle in. If you live like the truth is already enough. That night he revisited his old journals. He flipped through the pages of uncertainty, of shame, of new beginnings. Somewhere near the middle, he found a page he barely remembered writing. It read, "I am not who I was, but I'll never be who I could have been if I hadn't lied. I can only be who I choose to become now." He stared at that sentence for a long time. Then, with a pen trembling between his fingers, he added beneath it, "And that man is enough." As spring turned to early summer, Greg received an invitation to speak at a high school not far from where he grew up. The principal had followed his story for over a year and wanted students to hear about the real cost of pretending and the quiet power of truth. Greg almost declined. High schoolers were a tough crowd, but something told him it mattered. So he said yes. On the day of the talk, he stood in front of a gym full of teenagers, most of them distracted, some curious, a few openly skeptical. He didn't open with a dramatic story. He didn't drop statistics or wave around redemption like a trophy. He simply told them how easy it is to lie when you don't believe the truth is enough, how insecurity dresses itself in costumes, how applause is intoxicating, but healing is much quieter. "I lied because I didn't think I mattered," he said, "but I matter now, not because I was forgiven or praised, but because I started living like my truth had weight." That line, he noticed, got their attention. After the talk, a student came up and said, "I told my friends I was going into the army next year, but I'm not. I was just scared of telling them I didn't get in." Greg looked at him carefully. "It's not too late to tell the truth." The boy nodded. "I'm thinking about it." Greg offered a smile. "When you do, you'll feel like you can breathe again." That night, driving home under a sky streaked with soft pink clouds, Greg felt it again, that quiet certainty, not pride, not relief, just purpose. Back at the center, the workshop members were preparing for their first public reading. A local cafe had agreed to host an open mic night, and several members volunteered to share their work. Greg wasn't sure how many would show up, but the evening turned out to be more than he ever hoped for. Dozens came, friends, family, community members, even a few strangers who saw the flyer and were curious. The veterans took turns at the mic, reading poems, essays, memories, letters. One man spoke about the day he came home from deployment and didn't recognize his own reflection. Another read a story about a stray dog that followed him for 3 miles through a war zone. One woman read a list of names, friends who didn't make it, and ended with a soft, "I remember everyone." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Greg went last. He didn't bring a script, just a folded piece of paper with a few lines scrawled on it. "I'm not a veteran," he began, "but I used to pretend I was, for selfish reasons. And the worst part wasn't getting caught. It was realizing I didn't think I mattered without that lie. But the people in this room, they showed me something better. They showed me that truth, no matter how messy, how painful, how late, is always worth more than a costume. And because of that, I stand here now, not proud of who I was, but deeply grateful for who I get to be." When he stepped away from the mic, the applause was thunderous, but what moved him most was the way people looked at him, not like a fraud, not like a hero, but like a man who had been broken, then rebuilt, not by redemption but by responsibility. The week after the public reading at the cafe, Greg found himself walking slower. Not out of exhaustion, but in that odd, unfamiliar rhythm of someone who realizes the chapter they've been living is coming to a close. Spring sunlight spilled through the trees overhead, and the breeze carried the soft scent of fresh-cut grass and warm pavement. The world wasn't quieter, but after everything, after the lies, the shame, the rebuilding, the late nights rewriting apologies into action, Greg was finally still, not numb, not running, just and it was in that quiet during one of his usual walks to the center that it really hit him. The story he once faked had become real. He had found community, purpose, a version of himself that he didn't have to dress up or embellish. And somehow that version was enough. That afternoon, Rita called him into the office. Her desk was covered in papers, but her face wore that no-nonsense smile that Greg had come to admire. "I got a call from the city council," she said, not looking up. "They're starting a new pilot program, mental health, writing, and peer mentorship for transitioning vets. They want to model it after what we've built here." Greg blinked. "Here," Rita looked at him. "You think I don't talk about you when I'm in those meetings?" He laughed, a little embarrassed. "I just mop the floors and hand out notebooks." She leaned back in her chair. "You gave people a voice, and more importantly, you gave them a reason to use it." Then she pulled out an envelope and handed it to him. "They want you to be one of the program leads. Part-time, at first, city-backed, stipend included." Greg stared at the letter, the formal seal in the corner, his name printed clean across the top. "You sure they know who I am?" he asked. "They know exactly who you are," Rita said. "And that's why they picked you." He left the office that day, with the envelope tucked carefully into his bag and a question echoing through his chest. Was this really his life now? Not too long ago, he was hiding behind a stolen Valor jacket and trying to keep his world from collapsing. Now he was being trusted to build something lasting, something that mattered. And yet, Greg didn't let the feeling get to his head. He had learned to meet moments like these, not with self-congratulation, but with grounded gratitude. Life had given him a second chance, not because he deserved it, but because he was finally willing to live like he did. That weekend, he visited his father. They grilled burgers in the backyard, watching Max, now officially Greg's dog, chase moths with the intensity of a soldier on patrol. His father handed him a beer, sat down in a lawn chair, and said, "Your mom would have liked what you're doing." Greg looked up, surprised. They didn't talk about her often. She had passed when he was in his 20s, before the worst of it. "You think so?" he asked. "Yeah," his dad said, cracking open his own bottle. "She always had a soft spot for people who figured things out the hard way." Greg smiled, eyes stinging, just a bit. "Well, I definitely took the scenic route." His dad chuckled. "Yeah, but you made it back." Back at the center, the energy was shifting. Leon had started mentoring newer members of the group, helping them translate battlefield experiences into short fiction. Bill had finished the final draft of his memoir, 76 pages of sharp, unfiltered storytelling, and decided to leave copies at the local library for anyone who needed to read them. Even the quietest participants now spoke with assurance, their words no longer tentative but intentional. Greg knew that he didn't build all of that alone. But he also knew he helped create a space where it could grow. And just when things felt like they had settled into something sustainable, Greg received another letter, this one handwritten, with unfamiliar cursive. It was from the sister of a soldier he had once claimed to serve, beside someone whose name he'd plucked from a list of real veterans when building his fake backstory, thinking it would make the lie feel more authentic. He hadn't thought about that name in a long time. The letter was brief but clear. She had seen his podcast. She knew what he'd done, but she wanted him to know that her brother, who had died in service, had always believed in redemption, that he believed stories had the power to repair what guilt broke apart. And she hoped, in some strange way, Greg would carry his name now with truth, not fiction. Greg folded the letter gently and placed it in the same binder where he kept the group's first writings. He didn't know what to do with the weight of it, but he honored it in the only way he knew how, by continuing. On the last day of the spring semester at the university, his students surprised him with a plaque. It was handmade, simple wood, engraved with 5 words, "Thanks for seeing us through." Greg didn't cry, not in front of them, but later in his car. He let the tears come, because that's what this journey had been all about. Not becoming someone admired, not being seen as brave, but finally seeing others and himself with honesty and compassion. The kind of seeing that doesn't flinch or judge, the kind that heals. That night Greg walked Max through the quiet streets, the sound of wind, brushing through trees above him. He thought about where it all began. The lie, the unraveling, the long road back, and he thought about how far they'd all come. Not just him, but the people around him who chose to see more than his mistakes. People who taught him that truth isn't just something you tell, it's something you live. He stopped at the corner of his street, looked up at the stars, and spoke softly, not to anyone in particular, but maybe to all the selves he used to be. We didn't deserve a second chance, but we got one, and we used it. That counts. Then he looked down at Max, who wagged his tail and stared up like he understood. Greg smiled. "Come on, buddy. Let's go home." And they walked on, man and dog, night and silence, past and present, toward whatever came next. Not perfect, not forgotten, but true, at last.